You can't deny something that you're watching happening every single day. Take issue with the mechanism behind it, the mechanism that's used to explain what we see. The theory. Take issue with the theory if you want to. But to say evolution doesn't exist, evolution doesn't happen, evolution is a lie, that's like saying, well, I think the theory of gravity is utter bunk, therefore, I'm going to just float away when I walk out the front door tomorrow. You can debunk a theory behind something without debunking the actual thing that the theory is trying to explain. Debunk the theory of gravity doesn't mean you're going to float. You just got to come up with a better explanation for why you don't float. That's why it's so important to make the distinction between evolution and the theory of evolution. Does that make sense? Or are we all floating off
people do morning? When people say that we come from fish, I think that that's like a Ken Ham sort of an argument, and I don't think it's a very realistic one. It's not taking what evolution is really saying and using it appropriately, because I think if people realize that this idea that species just adapt over time, and sometimes they have these changes, and sometimes the changes work better for them in their environments, and then different species eventually form if they're isolated from one another, it's completely reasonable, and we do see it, just like you mentioned, Fiona.
Yeah, and so take issue with the explanations given all you want, but to deny what you actually observe and what you study, purely to go with an explanation found in a book which was that recites a tale which, prior to it being written down, was told around campfires in an oral tradition first. I'm going to read more than that, given the evidence.
If you look at Genesis 1:20 in the King James Version, you're going to see that there's a reference to fish eventually becoming winged animals and birds. And so when we have something like that right in the Bible, it to me opened my eyes to the fact that God might have used evolution in some way to bring us here. And I'm completely fine with the idea of guided evolution. So if he were able to somehow, we're the products eventually from primordial soup, I'm completely accepting that, because God, obviously that's a miraculous thing. And so it's truly amazing as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, personally, I've been asked this question quite a few times. So personally, where do I put God in the creation, given that I say that God is the creator of all? And personally, I think, well, he put the basic laws of physics in place. He lit the blue touch paper and he stood well back. Putting those basic laws of physics in place then dictates how the chemistry works out, which dictates how the biochemistry works out, which dictates how the biology works out. So there, it still puts God as the author of all. The difference is that opinion of mine, that belief of mine, is purely based on faith. And I freely admit I have no evidence for it, that God lit the blue touch paper and stood well back. That's a faith position. It's not a science position. It's a faith position. Don't ask me for any evidence for it. I have none, and I don't claim any.
No, I think, I mean, the problem that I see is when people try to pretend like there's a dichotomy between a belief in science and a belief in Christianity. And I think that there isn't this false dichotomy. I think they actually go together. And I think it's appropriate and correct for people to try to understand our science around us, our nature, and why everything is the way it is. And then when we have higher level questions of things like origins, meaning, morality, and purpose, then we start to think about the higher level answers to those questions, which include God.
But sometimes the answer is, I don't know.
Sure, of course.
And
it can't possibly know everything.
Yeah, it's not a shameful thing.
Oh, you speak for yourself.
Well, if you work in
Wait,
science,
the nobody in the universe knows more than 1% of anything, or less. Everybody in the universe knows less than 1% of everything in the universe, obviously. So since we can't possibly know everything, we have to accept the fact that a lot of times we don't know. But looking at a best explanation for what we do know sometimes can lead to the right and the correct outcomes.
if you work in science for any length of time, you discover the most common answer to any question you're ever asked is, I don't know. And in science, I don't know turns into a research grant. Let's find out.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
And there's no shame in that.
For example, we look at this idea of objective morality and whether or not humans have objective morality, and if we've sort of been guided towards these certain beliefs, for example, to follow the golden rule. Why is that something that's so prevalent in the world? And a lot of books have been written on stuff like this, and Tom Holland's recent book on Dominion points to Christianity as being a good source for some of the kinds of things that we're seeing today in Western societies, particularly.
But again, I go back to this idea that as soon as you start to say that you accept anything in science, the rejoinder is always, oh, well, you're not a real Christian. Because when you start, you can burrow really deep into this, that you end up having to reject all sorts of aspects of science.
Tell me one aspect of science that you have to reject to be a Christian.
Well, no, I'm not saying that is what you have to do. What I'm saying is this is the accusation that will get thrown out at you. For example, there's the physics behind the radiometric dating of the planet, which puts the planet a bit older than 6,000 years. And so they have to reject that science. There's a problem with that science. They've got to mess around with the speed of light to get round the starlight problem and all the rest of it.
You're basically really focusing on the young Earth creationists, because this does not speak to the vast majority of Christians on the planet.
Well, I know that because I'm a Christian.
I'm just saying the 6,000-year-old year, the young Earth creationism, that's a tiny portion of Christianity in the world when you consider the fact that Roman Catholics make up the vast majority of Christians in the world, and then we have the Greek Orthodox and others, and those religions are fine with evolution.
I know, I am a Roman Catholic. Here's the thing. You will find, though, that too often a discussion about evolution or about the age of the earth or about the how literal you should take Genesis 1 and 2, too often that debate gets bogged down in, well, if you believe that, then you're not a real Christian. And it's the typical no two Scotsmen fallacy. And you're thrown out of the body of the kirk because you don't believe the right way. But when you have to start denying all of the science that is backing up an old earth, and you're having to deny the physics behind radiometric dating and the biology behind changes in populations and how it relates to genes and gene frequencies and all the rest of it, pretty soon you've denied so much science that you can't even accept something as simple as, well, it's a good idea to vaccinate against smallpox and whooping cough and polio, because science denialism just keeps going. Now, I may be arguing at a slippery slope here, but I've seen it happen so many times that it begins with this: the earth must be young, we must reject the science that shows it's old, and it ends up in rejecting almost all of science. And then we end up with such brilliant theories as the Raiders of the Lost Ancient Power Source type thing.
Oh God, I remember that one.
Yeah, I've just remembered the name of it.
Yeah,
the Raiders of the Lost Ancient Power Source. So that's where it starts off as trying to support young Earth creationism by denying the scientific evidence, and then it moves on to by denying the science.
That's a problem because there are a lot of the atheists that I see today on social media are former young Earth creationists who were raised in young Earth creationist families, and then they went off to college and they learned about science. Maybe they looked at plate tectonics or any of the other vast majority of scientific findings that have pointed us to an older Earth, and they say, "Oh my gosh, obviously Christianity or the Bible or Judaism or whichever faith they're coming from is wrong." And so they leave their faiths and become very vocal, sometimes militant, anti-theists because they feel like they were just duped in early in life. And I think that's a shame.
Yeah, one of the most popular ways for people losing their faith is in discovering that young Earth creationism isn't quite as written in stone as they think, that they begin to realize that there's actually evidence against it. And as you said, they then wonder what else was I lied to about. And that's really sad because they are not aware that there is any middle ground. The belief in Christ has somehow been knitted into Genesis 1. And if you reject the literal telling of Genesis 1, then you are rejecting Christ. That's what they do.
I agree. And actually, I just saw it because yesterday I posted a video on evolution and I brought people's attention to Genesis 1:20. And the responses on the video are kind of amusing because some people are saying I'm not a true Christian because I don't believe in the 6-day version of God's creation. And there's a lot of different interpretations of Genesis. And to say that you definitely have the correct one is kind of, for people to say that, it's definitely the Walton interpretation, or it's definitely Hugh Ross's, or it's definitely the Ken Ham's. I would just say, just keep an open mind, but focus on what's really important, and that's Jesus.
Yeah. Have you ever seen some of these long-ass articles that have been written that are online? Does the hare chew the cud? Seriously.
Say it again?
Does the hare chew the cud?
The hearer, the person who's listening?
I think
like hare, as in like rabbit-like creature.
Yeah.
Looking at that, well, what's interesting is when we talk about things like evolution and we realize that came about in the 1800s. I mean, this whole idea with Darwinism, obviously, and you have going back to the early church fathers talking about it. Some of the early church fathers pointed to the Earth being very old, and so we have that kind of things before we had this whole idea.
Yeah, Augustine of Hippo. But yeah, no, I was asking about that the hare chewing the cud, because it all goes down to this needing to read the entire Bible literally. And I believe that a hare, as in the rabbit-like creature, is not an unclean animal. It's clean. And animals that chew the cud are clean. So somehow they've got to work in that hares chew the cud.
Yeah, I was confused by that when you said that, Fiona. I'm like, wait, hares aren't ruminants. Why would they chew cud?
Yeah.
Well, what they actually do, rabbits and hares, they have two types of droppings. There's the first lot that are very soft droppings, and they eat them again. So it goes through the digestive system twice, so they get even more out of the food. And so they've decided that counts as chewing the cud. And therefore they can, so on that basis, they can eat a hare. Because of the old Levitical laws. Because they have to somehow squeeze hares into being ruminants so that they can then still go along with the literal interpretation.
That's okay. Well, I learned something about non-ruminants now and cud, and that's
Go and look it up. There is a huge article written by somebody. Does the hare chew the cud?
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
don't get
pretty
me
fun.
started on mermaids.
I mean, it must make the parable of the sword very interesting to read. But
Yeah,
I mean, it's no surprising. I mean, I think this, if I'm not mistaken, this literal reading is something that got popularized by Ellen G. White. Like 200 years ago or something like that. Because first and
That
second,
was when,
you know,
the creation account reading of literal readings definitely got to be popular, was due to Ellen G. White's
mhm.
right. Because I've been looking, I even have a book on the shelf called Cultic Doctrine by Dale Ratzlaff, who used to be I think he was a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist Church for about 20 years before he got out. And like a lot of the writings that she did, she had like as literal as she could get for some of this stuff, and that's what led to some of the crazy ideas and doctrines she had, not just in terms of simple creation. Like she even had unique views on Adam and Eve. Was also like the dietary laws. Like she thought that basically like if you didn't follow the strict diet plan that she had gotten from the Bible, then you were pretty much hellbound. And if you didn't have your kids on this diet, you hate your kids and want them to die. Kind of aspect. That was like the kind of mindset coming from Ellen White in her writings, and that's how far the literalism took her.
The literal creationism really took root in about the 1960s, though. I mean, yes, it did come from Ellen G. White and her visions, but it took root in the 60s.
It got popular.
Yeah, and it's much more popular in the US than it is in Europe. When I first came online, I was gobsmacked that there were people still pushing young earth creationism and the literal and reading, not even interpretation, but the literal reading of Genesis, because there are so many holes in the literal reading of the Bible. I was just, it creates more problems than it solves. How many people here have tried to stone their unruly child at the city gates? Because that's what the Bible tells you to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, if you look at the 7 days and you look at the 6 days, you realize that there was always a day and a night and a close and an opening, and the seventh day is left open, and that gives us a good hint that that's actually part of an epoch.
I mean, and also you have to remember that the Bible has got many different literary, I can't think of the word, genres. We'll go with genres, because there are songs, there's poetry, there are allegorical stories. If anybody doesn't believe that there is anything allegorical in the Bible, I would say go read a parable.
Well, of course there is. We'd be literal sheep. We're not literal sheep, and Jesus isn't a literal door. So people have to be able to look at stuff and realize there's some metaphors in there.
And look at the parable of the Good Samaritan. Does anybody think there was literally a Good Samaritan and that scenario played out exactly as was described? No, it's, as the word I used earlier, a fable. It's a story with a moral truth to it. And the important thing is not the details of the story, it's the moral truth in it.
I agree with you. I completely agree. I think those, actually, I think if people who a lot of times do decide that they're going to be non-believers or who reject their belief systems that they had when they were younger, I think a lot of times it's because of other faith and not necessarily because they really paid much attention to what Jesus was saying in the Bible. I think if you just focus on Jesus, a lot of people, and maybe if you had, there's some hypocrites out there, and just don't focus on them, instead just focus on Jesus, I think that'd bring a lot of people to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Where are you anyway, Fiona? Are you over in Ireland?
Scotland.
I was trying to make out what your accent. It's like, what is that accent?
It's one of the standing jokes in here. People keep calling me Irish or Welsh or English.
You sound kind of like John Lennox.
No, I am Scottish through and through. Yeah. Hint of Glaswegian in there.
The Welsh joke came from your love of sheep. That's all. So
Yeah,
a handful of
well,
people get that joke.